talk about what the hell a neuroscientist is doing with a bunch of Formula One drivers?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the work that I do with Formula One drivers, and I do this work through a company called Hinsa Performance. Hinsa has spent nearly 2 decades supporting Formula One world champions and several other Formula One drivers as well. Probably in any given year, we might work with somewhere between 8 and 12 of the drivers on the grid. And my role really is to help support the coaches and medical staff who are sort of boots on the ground. They're at every race. The coaches that Hinsa provides to drivers are there. They're like the body person. They're there every day. They're doing the nutrition. They're doing the training program. They're organizing the travel schedule. They're, if you ever see like the person holding the umbrella, if it's sunny or rainy, or holding the helmet, right? That's often one of our coaches who's doing that. And initially, I came in more from a sort of a physiology and performance and kind of a little bit of the medical side, doing a lot. So I'm not directly responsible for any of the medical care, but I have a lot of experience looking at, say, blood tests from athletes, looking at nutrient status and some other things that can affect performance. So that was kind of some of the early stuff that I did. And then over time, as my own career has progressed, and I became a professor of neuroscience and all these other things, because I sort of started this work right when I was finishing my PhD. Now we might do some more stuff that's more directly related to the brain. So thinking about training, recovery, how that affects cognitive performance. I might help with things around sleep as well. And then often my role, my job title now is head scientist for motorsport for Hinsa Performance. And sometimes it's just, there's all this new technology, there's all these, new gadgets and gizmos and supplements and things. And it's my job to sort of kick the tires on it and figure out, is this really worth their time? Because they are so stretched, so busy, different time zone every week. If you're going to try and implement a new strategy, you have to be fairly confident it's going to work. And there's always somebody who's trying to sell these guys something, because then they can, you develop a new product, you get a driver to use it, you can say it's used in Formula One, right? That's a big marketing tool. So my job is often just to sort of put some guardrails around new techniques, new technologies, and make sure it's going to be, or as likely as possible that it's going to be beneficial to a given driver.
Incredibly cool, man. It might be one of my dream job titles. Like working on the science behind high performance is something that's always been massively interesting to me. I love thinking about what really sets those people apart. Like what's happening in the brain of somebody when they're doing something that just seems completely impossible. Have you seen Free Solo? I recently rewatched Free Solo, and that's just the cleanest example of like, how is any of this remotely possible? Like, what is going on in this man's brain? With your experience working so closely now with really high performers, has anything been answered there for you? Do you have a clearer model of like what really does set these people apart? Like what's happening differently in their brains and ours?
So there's a couple of things, and some may just be innate. There's certainly a genetic component to very high level performance, but some is certainly learned. And the most obvious, but one that's definitely worth talking about, because I think it relates to the things that we do ourselves, is the skill development itself, right? If you look at a Formula One driver, they're driving at 200 miles an hour, navigating 19 other cars. Next year it'll be 21 other cars. If you look at the steering wheel, it's like 40, 50 different buttons and things, each with its own sub menus and all these different things that they have to do. Plus they have to communicate with the pit wall and do all this right at those high speeds. And people look at that and be like, well, that just seems impossible, right?
Yeah.
But you have to remember that they've spent literally probably close to 2 decades, most of them, if not 3 decades, once they're very experienced. And this is all they do, right? They started in karting. They probably came up through the lower levels, Formula, maybe some kind of Formula 4 series, Formula 3, Formula 2, Formula 1. And the brain is capable of amazing things when you just like really dedicate it to like one area of skill development. So yeah, I don't think that genetically my reaction time is as good as Lando Norris's, right? He was time recording, he's a brand new world champion as of yesterday.
Yeah.
But I do believe that I could become an incredibly skilled driver if I had invested the time and had the resources, infrastructure, and that kind of stuff that he had and that these drivers had. So one is just remembering that we are actually capable of incredible skill development, but it also requires incredible resources and dedication in order to do that. And so, by the time you get to the top levels, a different car will have a slightly different setup within a different team. You'll have to learn all these new things, but sort of the basic mechanics of how this works, you kind of just like, they're now innate. They've kind of become ingrained into your brain. It sort of happens automatically. So that's one part, is the skill development piece. And then the other part is almost certainly a psychological piece.
Yeah.
So the best drivers, especially those who perform well for long periods of time, and this is probably going to be relevant to Alex Honnold or whoever it is you're thinking about. They have developed an incredible resilience, and I don't sort of, when I say resilience, there's sort of like some very specific psychological components that are part of that. And a lot of it is self-reflection, self-compassion, which includes components of mindfulness and common humanity. And it's sort of understanding that we make mistakes. We sort of have the capacity to overcome them. It's not just like these guys are constantly beating themselves down to do more and more and more and more, which is often what we kind of think of as these people who are really resilient, but that's not quite it.
Yeah, the Kobe Bryant mentality.
Yeah, or the David Goggins mentality is that's not how most people operate or can operate for long periods of time. It requires much more. Yeah, self-compassion is one of the ways that to look at it. So this ability to engage in these tasks, overcome difficulties, really but work hard, and be engaged in the process, right? Most of them are very process oriented rather than being highly focused on a given outcome, right? They love the process. They love getting better. They love working with engineers to improve the car. They love like making these small steps in terms of their performance. And it's that kind of process orientation that can make a big difference in terms of long-term performance as well. So
Yes,
none of these things are like you're just like born with them, and that's what makes you an amazing athlete, right? All of this is the result of the incredible work that they've put in. There are probably some for some sports and some levels of elite performance where there's just something slightly different about that brain that we don't fully understand. Like if you're willing to summit,
yes,
was it El Capitan in
El
Yosemite?
Capitan, yeah.
I'm not sure how much like you could probably teach some of that, but maybe not all of it.
Yeah.
So there are some things that we still have to understand, but there's a lot that is really relevant to all of us that we could see and we could build ourselves as it relates to performance.
Yes, nicely said.
MindLab Pro is a scientifically backed nootropic designed to enhance memory and focus and keep you as mentally sharp as possible in 2026. And before you click off, it has been scientifically proven in not one, but 3 separate double-blind placebo-controlled trials that it really works. In one study, healthy adults took MindLab Pro for 30 days and improved on 3 separate information processing tasks. In another trial, adults improved improved on a set of memory tasks. The interesting part is in both trials, this improvement did not happen in the placebo group, which is a really strong piece of evidence that what is making the difference is in this bottle. MindLab Pro has no proprietary blends, complete transparency on ingredients, and has full third-party testing so you know exactly what's in the bottle. Performance Labs is one of the most scientifically rigorous supplement companies that exists, and that is the exact reason that I have decided to partner with them. I also take their sleep stack every single night, and they sell a bunch of other high quality supplements. They offer a 30-day money back guarantee, so there's literally zero risk in trying them out. You're supporting the giant shoulder by using the link in the description. Now back to the episode.
Something that I've been really interested in for a while is cognitive optimization. And trying to figure out where the pseudoscience is and what's real about it. You know, I think those terms had a big setback, like, you know, a decade, 2 decades ago, whatever it was, when a lot of these brain training studies kind of didn't replicate. What we saw was like, you practiced all of these different puzzles, you just got really good at those puzzles, right? They didn't transfer to general problem solving skills like people wanted it to, and how it might have even seemed intuitive that doing these problems would help some generalized category. So I'm curious of where that research is now. Like, what of these cognitive abilities can we train? What generalizes well, and what just doesn't generalize well at all? What will just, you know, doing more Sudokus gets you better at Sudokus? But are there tasks now in 2025 that we've figured out that do generalize pretty well to some pillars of cognitive optimization?
Yeah, so I'll just start by saying that I have increasingly struggled with the word optimization, because often we don't know what optimal is or what we're optimizing for. So, and that can come from any aspect of, physiology or performance, because often we're trying to improve things, right? We can certainly improve performance. We can improve brain health. We can work on cognitive enhancement. But like, when it comes to optimization, that assumes that I know exactly what optimal is and exactly what the target is. And more often than not, we don't, right? So if we try and think about progress, right, we think about progress in the process rather than that we have some like definite goal that we're aiming for. And when you're absolutely right. There have been several decades of discussion around cognitive enhancement, brain training. Like, what can we actually improve? And the idea that people talk about is one called transfer. So there are sort of multiple layers of transfer, but you can think about near transfer and far transfer. And what you're talking about is far transfer. I do some kind of training, and then it improves function in some area out in the real world that I care about, right? Because you don't really care about how you perform in the brain training game. You want to have better working memory, better decision making, executive function, right? You want to feel like your brain is working better processing speed. So when you have near transfer, it's very, very much like you said, you get better at the task itself, or tasks very similar to it. So near transfer is like, if you learn how to drive a car, you're going to be better at driving a van or a lorry, right? They're similar tasks.
Yes.
Or another car. But far transfer is you learn how to drive a car and then you get better at speaking French, right? That was the dream. That's kind of what we're thinking about, which just like automatically sounds like that's a bit wild. And so most cognitive training modalities don't result in far transfer. And then the question is, well, what is it that could transfer? And I think there are some things that we don't necessarily give enough credit to. So probably one of the best overall ideas for transfer is something they call learning to learn. So if you spend time engaging in something that requires focused attention such that you improve performance, you are training your focus and attention so that you can focus and attend to other things.
Yeah.
So if you get better at learning one skill, you do generally see that you get better at learning another skill. Not that you just get better at that other skill automatically, but you have become better at, actually engaging your brain in something cognitively challenging, right? This is one reason why educational attainment is the most important factor for early life cognitive development up until our sort of 20s and 30s. Essentially, the longer we spend in school, the better we do in school, because we're constantly learning how to learn, actually engaging our brain in things that require focus and attention and memory and all this kind of stuff. We see cognitive development as a result. So that's useful because often we feel like our focus and attention are increasingly becoming more fractured and, less just like are not working as well. So we know that if we actually engage in learning something, we're probably developing our focus muscles.
Totally.
And then beyond that, I think what we see is that the skills and the training that has the most capacity for actually some kind of far transfer, improving those things that we kind of need on a day-to-day basis, are those that are complex and very much kind of baked into how humans normally engage with the world. So sometimes it's not brain training at all. It's learning, it's learning languages, it's learning musical instruments, it's learning complex motor patterns or sports. It's complex social interactions. Some things combine all of those, like dancing includes like music and social component and physical activity plus complex motor patterns that seems to have an outsized benefit for the brain in terms of some of these core brain functions. And there have been some recent studies that kind of look at these creative and complex skill learning processes, and you see improved structure and function of core networks within the brain that are susceptible to the processes of aging. So you can kind of see improvement in skill and then improvement in brain function and structure that kind of comes with that. So when I talk about brain training, like Sudoku doesn't make it onto the list. So Sudoku counts as something that psychologist Gloria Mark calls a rote activity. So it does require some focus, but it's not cognitively challenging, right? The things that we're talking about that really do move the needle require real focused effort. You're learning a complex skill. It requires failure. And it requires sort of like slowly improving function over time. And that's really what seems to drive neuroplasticity and brain function.
Yes.
So yeah, use it or lose it is certainly a real thing, but we need to really use it on these complex tasks.
Yes. If we bring this back to the F1 drivers at 200 miles per hour, 200 kilometers, I'll admit to be completely ignorant to F1, actually. I'm just interested in the high performance thing. I really don't. Yeah. I presume that they're traveling very, very fast. They have lots of buttons to press. In trying to get a driver ready for race day to make all of those tiny micro decisions, are you training them pretty much entirely in a car, or have you found that there are other near transfer or even far transfer skills that you can train those drivers on that do produce better results on race day that you can tell us? I don't know if there's camp secrets here that aren't allowed to be said on podcasts, but I'm always curious, like, what's really going on behind the scenes?
Yeah, it's a great question, and this is something we discuss a lot. I'm sure I'm allowed to say that, and it's very different from driver to driver. Once you get to that level, there are almost certainly some individual tweaks that can be made. Formula One itself as a series doesn't actually have that much time in the car or that much testing in the actual car that you're racing every week. This has sort of changed over the years, but they spend a lot of time in simulators, and sometimes they do testing in previous versions of the car or other things. So like they spend a good amount of time in the car, but when you're like actually driving the car that you're currently driving and competing in, it usually only happens on race weekends. So you don't have that much time to actually be in the car outside of a more competitive environment, or that they have practice sessions during the race weekends. But that's really your time. And so then simulators are a big part of training. And then it just depends on, for a given individual, are there specific skills that we might like to work on. Often they might be related to how somebody performs under fatigue. So it's also very physically demanding. You don't necessarily get to practice the physical strain that you experience. You can practice the cognitive strain in a simulator, but the physical strain is harder. So then we might think about, so then a lot of it is related to actual physical performance. And you know that if you're fitter and you're stronger, then a given load will have less of an effect on your cognitive function, because you're essentially, as you start to become fatigued, your sort of like cognitive buffer declines, and you're less capable of managing multiple inputs. So it might work in that area. But in reality, a lot of what we might think about with the driver is more related to how do you get the best adaptation from the stimulus that they're already getting, because they're constantly driving, traveling in the car, in engineering meetings, media commitments, sponsor commitments. So often it's more about how do we get these guys to switch off, sleep, relax, recover, because they're getting, driving that car is an incredible stimulus, right?
Yes.
And it's very sport specific. So at that level, often it's how do we support the adaptation to the stimulus you're already getting, rather than how do we layer on multiple new stimuli. Sometimes there's some of that, but it's less common. So then often we're thinking about cognitive development, we're doing a lot more and building a lot more in driver development. So we work with drivers at all levels, from karting up to Formula One. So then it might be, how can we build in new cognitive stimuli that help to develop some of these skills for somebody who eventually wants to be in Formula One. And so I think one of the most promising areas for that, and it's something that I'm doing quite a lot of work in and have sort of like a lot of connections working with several companies who are developing technologies, is in the virtual reality world. So
cool.
With virtual reality, you're able to create a much more complex stimulus than, say, you're on a desktop computer just like clicking buttons on a flat screen, right? It's in 3D. You can add a physical component, right? There are ways to make it physically demanding, so it's a workout for the brain and the body at the same time. You're processing visual stimuli, you could be processing auditory stimuli. So that is much more similar to the complex environment that our brains kind of respond to in order to improve performance. So I think that's a really promising area, and that's something that younger drivers in particular will benefit from, because they can't always get access to the kind of car or complex machinery that they might eventually like to drive. But we can create very complex cognitive environments that require tracking multiple objects, making decisions in very short periods of time, very short require very fast processing speed, short reaction times. They require very precise hand movements, because that's really important. So you're learning some very complex motor skills. So response inhibition, so like doing something or not doing something and making those split-second decisions. So you can start to train all of those things in the virtual reality environment. So that, like, I will say we're right at the beginning of that, but there are some studies using some of these platforms that show improved performance in particularly in developing athletes, youth tennis, areas of motorsport. I've seen data, they're not published yet, but in American football, in collegiate athletes in American football. So I think that's really where the next kind of era of cognitive training is going to come from.
Extremely cool, yeah. So these VR environments aren't necessarily car specific. You're not in the car. You're doing all of these various different cognitive tasks that are specific to training some pillar of executive function, decision making, working memory, making decisions under stress, under sleep deprivation, whatever it is, and you're aiming to make progress. So it is near transfer or far transfer is because you're not in a car. Like these are you're training different skill sets.
Yeah, so a lot of this would be
Super
considered transfer,
interesting.
or at least sort of mid transfer, and it's actually interesting. So a lot of this work I do, I have a very close colleague. We've written papers together. We have a podcast together. Is called Josh Turkner. He's a neurologist, and we were actually together this weekend, and we were talking about this exact problem as it relates to all sports, actually. So there are a lot of virtual reality training environments and training programs that are being developed that are very sport specific. So here's one for tennis where you do tennis things, you play tennis, and here are ones for American football or baseball where you do baseball things or American football things. There is a risk, though, that when what you're trying to train is kind of similar to the sport but also very different, that you might get an interference effect. Like, so you're learning how to play tennis in virtual reality really well, but not all of those skills transfer over to tennis in the real world. So it might actually hold you back in some way. So I think the goal here really is far transfer. You're just like training these basic functions of the brain, including different types of attention, prolonged periods of focus, being able to overcome mistakes and errors and things like that, which are going to be a big part of that, especially if you're sort of like pushing the envelope of function. And, it's frustrating, and you sort of get better at that process. And I think that's going to be that you're sort of like training those core aspects of the brain so that you can then apply them in the scenario that you're trying to function in. So like, it's a much harder problem to solve, but I think
extremely
less potential downside and more potential upside.
Yeah, I've been a tennis coach for 10 years now. Nothing as technical as putting people in VR environments or anything remotely close to that. But so I thought a lot about the problem of like how to improve people's tennis game quickly, and I'd be super interested on, if you were running like a longitudinal experiment where in one group you have players practicing 4 times per week on the court, and then maybe another group where players are practicing 2 or 3 times per week on a court, and then 2 or 3 times in like a simulator, and seeing really how those differences pan out over a number of months, see what improvements can be made. I'd be curious of I think what I've gotten from you so far is that a lot of it is very adapting the protocol to the individual person, like what they're weak on.
Yeah.
That's something that I think you could do in tennis in a VR environment. Like if someone is really struggling with their like their backhand, on the far left of the court when it's out wide, that would be something where you could just put them in that situation again and again and again and again. I would love to see. Is there any data on tennis yet? Do you think is there any data on how these things improve, or are we still very early days?
So in that specific example, I'm not sure how easy that is to achieve in VR, because I know enough about tennis to be dangerous in this conversation, but I imagine you're out the far edge of the court, backhand.
Yeah.
What is it that you're trying to train? Because exact pressure, power, spin, racket angle, that kind of stuff, you can't train that in virtual reality, right? That requires you hitting a real ball in real life.
Yes. Right. Okay.
But if there are some other areas related to, and then it's processing speed, anticipation, thinking about ball trajectories, right? So like that kind of stuff you could train in VR. And there's actually a lot where you're sort of doing anticipatory movement. So you're kind of, something gets shot at you and you have to figure out where it's going to be so that you can catch it. I think that kind of stuff might be helpful, and maybe that's where a weakness is coming from in that given player. There's one platform that I know of that is published in tennis. It's called Mastermind, and they showed improved performance in junior tennis players. I could even send you that paper.
That'd be really interesting.
And Mastermind is a platform that you can get on a MetaQuest. You just pay a subscription. You go in, there's like a cognitive test that you do first. I think it's like 20 or 30 minutes. they look at some of these core functions, and then there's there's a whole bunch of different games that you can play. Plus, it can build you a training program based on what it thinks are your sort of cognitive weaknesses, and it's focused largely on. So they also have evidence for like school performance. So how kids are doing actually learning in an educational environment, and they have some evidence for like I said, junior sports performance. And so you can get like a training program tailored to you. And a lot of the games that they have, I think, and this is maybe one of the reasons why it works very well for tennis, is because it's lots of catching balls, figuring out where balls are going to go, trying to like stuff coming from your peripheral vision, having to kind of dodge stuff that comes at you, rapid decision making, lots of anticipation. But it's all actually, most of the shapes tend to be balls, and they're like coming at you in different ways and different styles, trying to train different aspects of cognitive function. So yeah, in that there are several platforms, but that's one where there's some evidence in tennis.
I guess it really depends on what level the player is at and what level you're trying to get to. Because I would see that, at the top level, I don't think that's going to be particularly useful then. I remember reading Bounce by I think it's Bounce by Matthew Syed, and he kind of dived into the research on like what separates top performers. And one intuition everyone has is that like high level table tennis players and tennis players are going to have these insane reflexes. Yeah. And I found that it doesn't really pan out exactly like that most of the time. Like Roger Federer, it turns out, just has not quite bang average reflexes, but definitely not like what you would expect for the most graceful man to ever step onto a court. And what they determined was that it's mostly pattern matching. And that there's all of these patterns that those players are receiving in the orientation of their body position, where they're looking. Like there's probably thousands of subconscious signals that Roger Federer's brain is just incredibly good at understanding as, okay, that because his body is faced that way, his racket is that, his strings are there, this is going to be a cross-court forehand, I'm going to position myself, so they're just picking up on all of these subconscious signals. So I wasn't sure what the state of the VR was, like if that was possible to do in a simulator now. Can you have a player on another side of the court and you're actually there swinging a racket, and all the sensors are in the tennis racket as well, and you're hitting the ball. But like, I don't know if that exists yet, but that would be really cool.
Yeah, that kind of stuff is coming, I'm sure. I think that you're right that, and this is the same problem with the Formula One drivers, right? Which is that they're already so good that like what extra amount of performance can you squeeze out just through some kind of additional training paradigm?
Yes,
tricky to that's not very specific to that sport. It's tricky to figure out, but as you're trying to develop athletes, I think there's a huge promise for this stuff, and some of those other things are certainly coming, but less well developed.
Yeah, very cool. Super excited to see how that evolves over the next couple of years. I presume a field you've looked at is brain stimulation. I'm curious about this. Is this something that the latest F1 drivers are playing around with? Different methods of stimulating circuits in the brain to improve executive function. I've spoken to a few people on the podcast about this, not strictly related to performance, but more related to mental health in some cases. But my understanding is the data seems pretty strong on different methods of like transcranial magnetic stimulation, in terms of it just having some pretty good effects on things like working memory, executive function. Are you familiar with this space at all?
So yes, to an extent, and I have several colleagues who work in this area. I think right now the best evidence really is in like clinical scenarios. So you're treating depression, right?
Yes.
So there's the tDCS halo for depression as a result. So transcranial direct current stimulation. People are doing tDCS, tACS, so transcranial alternating current stimulation, and TMS, so transcranial magnetic stimulation for like Alzheimer's disease or cognitive decline. And so I have a colleague who works in that area. That you can also stimulate with light, right? So photobiomodulation. There are different ways that you can stimulate the body with vibration in a ways that it could sort of like activate the vagus nerve or the autonomic nervous system. And in reality, it's very much yes, we can apply this stimulus and we can get this short-term improvement in performance for this one specific cognitive test. But how you then apply that in the elite sports scenario, for instance, is much less well understood.
Right.
And often, so the way I think about this is there's no biological free lunch, right? So if I can enhance one area of cognitive function, but I'm probably then decreasing, in the short term, function in a different area of the brain, because we've sort of focused all the stimuli in one area. And so when you're talking about these very complex performances in very complex environments, it's very difficult to say that I am stimulating the right thing at the right time that can broadly enhance performance. And right now we just don't have that. So
Yes.
photobiomodulation, like there's nice data but in healthy individuals improving some aspects of cognitive function. There's probably some of the best evidence is for recovery from like traumatic brain injury and concussions. Like still there's a lot to be done there, but there's some promising studies there. When you talk about something like TMS, my colleague Andrea Stocco, who studies TMS, he calls it the sledgehammer of neurostimulation, because basically you're just like piling huge magnetic fields into the brain to kind of broadly stimulate it. But if we were trying to think about how we would do, which seems to be beneficial in certain psychiatric disorders, it might be beneficial in Alzheimer's disease or cognitive decline. But what we really need is two things. We need very targeted stimulation for very specific networks that are related to the thing that you're trying to improve performance at. And then, and this is something that hasn't really been done enough in the literature yet, is so if you've opened up the capacity for neuroplasticity through stimulation, which is what you're trying to do, it's one of the main goals, you then need to direct that neuroplasticity at something, right? So often they're just doing tACS, tDCS, TMS, and then the individual just goes about their lives normally afterwards.
Right.
Whereas it would make much more sense to stimulate the brain and then say, okay, now we're going to do the task that you want to get better at.
Now we're going to hit 1,000 forehands or 1,000 backhands and see what happens.
Exactly. And that hasn't been done at the kind of level that I want to see it yet. So
let's get on it, man. Let's get started. Let's let's get started on this. This seems
yeah, it's super promising, super important. Like my core belief is that the way we use our brains, the way we stimulate our brains, is the primary driver of brain function. We can stimulate our brains through hitting 1,000 forehands, right? But especially once we've started to lose some function, or then some of these external stimulation modalities become potentially really powerful.
Very cool.
But so what I'll say is then in the short term, like what we have right now, and you asked a part of this question right at the beginning, and I didn't fully answer it, is that we're much more thinking about how do we in the moment leverage what you've already developed, like the skills that you already have. And that's generally related to sort of like baseline health and sleep and some of these other factors, and then your arousal state at the time that you're trying to perform. And so thinking about how we might manipulate your physiology in real time to get you into the right state of arousal in order to perform well. And so you might need to increase arousal. You might need to decrease arousal if you're like overly anxious or kind of worried about the thing you have to perform at. So often where we're at, especially at the very high levels of performance, is you've already done all the stuff, right? You're in good shape. Your body will perform incredibly well. It's how do we get you in the right state at that time in order to maximize the likelihood that will happen.
Something that always strikes me when I talk to neuroscientists is just how staggeringly complex the brain really is. It's this incredible prediction engine, always trying to make sense of the world and keep us safe. But it's important to remember we're still running ape hardware. Our brains weren't even remotely built for the chaos of modern life, and sometimes they just get scrambled. I've recently had some difficulty in my own personal life, and I realized that it was about time my own ape prediction system got the gym workout and just rebalancing that it's probably needed for quite a long time. So I booked my first therapy session with BetterHelp, who I'm incredibly excited to be partnering with on this video. A massive umbrella review of hundreds of randomized control trials found that nearly every meta-analysis of psychotherapy favored it over control conditions. In other words, mental health professionals from decades of research consistently find that talking therapies do actually work. BetterHelp is an entirely online therapy platform designed to make that process incredibly simple. You can connect with a licensed therapist from your home on your schedule through video, audio, or even text with literally no fuss at all. What I like about it is that you can switch therapists at any time until you find someone who you personally can build rapport with and open up to, which is such a critical part of therapy at no extra cost. If you've ever thought about trying therapy, or you're just feeling a little bit stuck in your own head lately like I was, this might be a great first step that I really couldn't recommend more. Visit betterhelp.com/giantshoulder to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp/giantshoulder, and in doing so, you also support the channel. Links are down below, because sometimes the most powerful way to understand your own brain is just to talk about it.
Yeah. What comes to mind there is flow. I've had a bunch of podcasts about flow, and I find this concept super interesting. And like, I know myself that if I go for a run and I can access flow, I feel like 10x the athlete. I'm like, I could just, I went out for a 5K, but I'm feeling great. I might just run a marathon. Like, you just feel so much better, and you don't even get why. It doesn't even make sense. You just feel like a different human. I think F1 driving probably is just flow heaven immediately. I would imagine that you can't not be in flow doing that kind of task because it's so fast paced. Your skills balance are just like right at that level all the time. But if you spent a lot of time thinking about like where the good science is for flow, how to get people into flow and not, because I know there's some bad science here. It's hard to, again, kind of weed it apart. What are your thoughts on flow in general for optimal performance?
Yeah,
or enhancing performance, because you don't like the word optimal.
It's a really interesting question, and I think flow, like, I think we're kind of at the tail end of this moment that flow had out in the sort of the popular world. There were lots of books written about flow, and everybody's trying to get into flow. And I think it's interesting that I don't think most Formula One drivers spend most of the time in flow. My guess is, that's probably not happening.
It seems impossible to me that you could do that job not in flow, but this is just my ignorance. I don't know anything about the sport.
We'll get there. We'll get there in a second. So,
okay.
The way that I like to describe flow is it's the maximal expression of a complex learned skill, right? You are so good at this thing, and you're in the zone, and it all just happens automatically. So, I have a book coming out in a few months, and actually, I have a quote in the book from a Formula One driver called Ayrton Senna. Some people consider him to be the best Formula One driver of all time, where he describes driving at the Monaco Grand Prix in flow, and he's basically like, I am not in control of my body, and I'm driving faster than everybody else, and I don't know how I'm doing it. Right. That's essentially the sort of the summary from the quote. And that's what flow feels like, right? It's just like it's all happening. And it happens in music and sports, and when you're kind of like part of a team, or like you mentioned, sort of like running, everything sort of like happens automatically. But what's much more common in elite sports performance is not a flow state, but it's what people call a clutch state. So a clutch state, you're still performing to the best of your abilities, and world championships and Olympic finals are won in clutch states, but it's hard work, right? It requires significant mental effort in order to achieve it, and both clutch and flow states are achieved through achieving like ideal levels of arousal, right? So when you think about this, people might have heard of something called the Yerkes-Dodson arousal curve, but it's basically, you imagine some bell curve where along the x-axis, along the bottom, it's level of arousal. On the y-axis, or the side, up and down, it's level of performance. And at low levels of arousal, you're a bit detached, disengaged, bored, like not really into it. at high levels of arousal, you're stressed, anxious, sweaty, jittery. Somewhere in between, there's this like perfect amount of arousal, and that it differs based on the sport, right? An Olympic archer requires a very different level of arousal to an Olympic 100-meter sprinter, even though they're both in the Olympic final doing the best in the world at what they do.
Yeah.
And so I think most athletes, when they're performing at their best, they're performing in a clutch state. It requires optimal arousal, but it requires mental hard work. And that's also important for skill learning. Like if you're learning and you're trying to get better, one of the most important aspects is the process of failure, making mistakes, learning, adapting, right? That's how the brain, that's what drives neuroplasticity, right? Because if you can already do it, the brain has no reason to change. So you create this mismatch between what you think you want to do and what you're actually capable of doing. That opens up the gates for neuroplasticity. And then over time, you slowly get better. That can't happen in flow because it's uncomfortable. You're not actually expressing a skill you already have because you're trying to improve the skill that you have. So I think flow states are super interesting, really important, right? You can see like amazing performance in flow states. But I think we spent a lot of time chasing flow when actually flow was not the thing that we wanted. Especially when we're trying to advance our current levels of function and improve skill levels. You can't do that in flow because it requires mistakes, failures, discomfort, which is sort of antithetical to the idea of flow.
Interesting. I presume in your model, like the clutch state and the flow state operate on the same continuum, and like most people will go through a clutch state before they enter a flow state, and really these are just words that we're using and they're poorly defined neurochemistry wise. But like is that how you sort of think of it, that like everyone will go through an effortful stage? Like I think I had Stephen Kotler on the podcast who's written a bunch of good books on this, and I think he talks about the stages of flow, and the first one being effort. Like there's an effortful stage where the things are hard, but once you push through, then you can reach flow sometimes. This definitely be the case for me in most sports that I do, that it always starts out sucky, and sometimes you reach flow and sometimes you don't, and I can't figure out what's the difference between those two. Because it always sucks at the start, but then sometimes it sucks at the end, and sometimes it's good at the end.
Yeah. And so I would think about it very, very, very similarly. Although it's like, it's funny because you sort of have to push through the effortful stage, but the thing is, if it's too effortful or you're pushing too hard, right, you're not going to achieve flow either. It sort of has to sort of like click and happen naturally. But the main thing for me is that we're capable of amazing performance without achieving flow, and right, I think most athletes appreciate, right, there's like this rule of thirds as it comes to performance, as it comes to training, which is like a third is just going to feel amazing. Right, you feel great, you feel unstoppable. That's when you want to try and run, whether you're in flow or not. Right, that's when you want to run a marathon, when you're planning to run 5K. A third will just be like fine, right? Show up, get the work done, and a third is just going to suck, and you're just going to have to grind through it, right? And that it just is what it is. And sometimes you know why, sometimes you don't. And so I think this is one of the reasons why, I'm not a big fan of the word optimization. Is that like, things aren't always going to be optimal. Sometimes you just have to like show up and get it done anyway. And that still contributes to long-term performance.
Yes. Awesome. I thought that was a really good whistle-stop tour of lots of different cognitive enhancing tools. I want to go to cognitive decline for the last part of the podcast, because I know you've done some really interesting work here. What's the right way to think about what's actually happening in the brain as it ages, as our cognitive performance declines?
So there's a few different things that are happening at the same time. The one that I'm most interested in is that the brain's main role is this thing called allostasis, which has a really nice definition that I really like, which is achieving stability through change. That is the definition of allostasis. And what that essentially means is that the brain and body are constantly matching function to demand, right? So if I increase demand by going and doing a lot of running, the body invests a lot of time into improving physical capacity, right, to meet those additional demands. That is essentially the process of training. The brain is essentially the same. So I think a lot of what happens when we have cognitive decline is that we stop creating demands for our brains, and our brains decrease function as a result, right? When you stop training, you become detrained, you lose strength, you lose fitness, because you no longer need that capacity, because you no longer have those demands on your body. And that seems to be very similar for the brain. So we get to some point in life, we stop learning, we stop doing difficult things, we just do the same thing again and again and again and again in our work, where we develop routines, we don't go out as much, we don't meet new people as much. We feel very busy, but that's not the same thing. And so Josh Turkman and I wrote a paper a couple of years ago where we essentially hypothesized that a significant driver of cognitive decline is that we just stop engaging our brains in the things that create function. All the stuff that we've already talked about. So some of it is just the brain naturally responding to a loss of complex inputs and a requirement of complex function. Of course, at the same time, there are other things that are going on. So there's like the general process of aging, and I think actually some of aging is related to that, right? Aging as an idea is still discussed. Like, what even is aging? Like, why does it even happen? And one theory of aging is that it's a continuation of the processes of development. And the processes of development are very much driven by stimulus, right? We talked about education and how that builds brains and cognitive function in the first place. So, a lot of development is just refining your function to the environment that you're in. And so if you remove complex stimuli, you no longer are learning complex skills, right? You will refine function, and that results in a decline in function. So that could be one way but then there are sort of like the general processes of aging, which are influenced by a huge number of environmental factors: physical activity, sleep, exposures, alcohol, smoking, air pollution, nutrient status plays a big role. And then there's also some, as you get older, you're going to accumulate, part of it is aging, part of it is just being out in the world and things happen. You're going to accumulate some kind of processes of damage and sort of stress responses, injury responses in the brain. That's where we might see the accumulation of certain proteins like amyloid and tau, which people will talk about a lot when it comes to Alzheimer's disease. But some of that, or a lot of that, again, is related to the environment. So that's things that we can change by sort of creating a supportive lifestyle. And then another part is we can create buffers against those things. So what neuroscience calls resilience and reserve. So resilience is, how does your brain deal with the accumulation of these proteins and pathologies? And all the stuff we've talked about actually helps to build resilience. So if you're more physically active, you can maintain brain function in the face of even having a significant amount of amyloid or tau in your brain, because it creates resilience. And then there's reserve, which is like, how much additional capacity do you have in the system, both structurally in terms of just like the amount of brain you have, plus functionally, like how well do those circuits work? And again, complex stimuli, social interaction, skill learning, physical activity, sleep, those help to build reserve as well. So then all of those different things interact to create this process of cognitive function and cognitive decline, which some people may eventually experience as dementia. And so it's not just one process. It's how do all those different factors figure into your own environment, your own genetic susceptibility. And it's why each individual with dementia experiences it very differently. They have very different, they might have different functional changes that you see, different periods of decline, all that kind of stuff. And I think it's because it's all these different factors sort of interacting to result in the end, so like what happens in the end.
Super well said, man. I think that's such a well articulated model for thinking about the whole process holistically. What comes to mind is, in my last triathlon, there was an 80-year-old who finished the race, and like by the end of it, like everyone was just there bawling, crying, seeing this 80-year-old man like finishing off the last leg, and like he looked like he was in such good shape.
Yeah.
You know, like he clearly did not let age as an objective number get in the way of his physical goals. And, you know, I hope he lives to 100. Has there been really good work breaking down aerobic training versus resistance training versus like free sport?
Yeah. Great question. So those different types of training seem to support slightly different processes and then support different areas of brain function. So aerobic training, including like low-level aerobic training, but also now going up to sort of anaerobic type sprints. So there's like an intensity gradient. Those seem to be particularly good at supporting the functions of the gray matter of the brain. So that's kind of like the outer wrinkly cortex. And then some of the deeper structures of the brain are also considered gray matter, like the hippocampus, which sort of sits right inside our ears, really important for memory. So aerobic type exercises seem to be particularly good at supporting memory function. Whereas resistance training is particularly good at supporting the white matter, which is the sort of fatty bit in between those two areas I talked about. It's really important for very fast connections. Humans have more white matter than any other species. It's probably a core reason why we have the complex brains that we do. Resistance training seems to support white matter function and structure. And with that comes improvements in executive function, decision making, and also maybe like some say that like global cognition, so like, which is if you do a bunch of different cognitive function tests, you like add up all the scores. Resistance training seems to be particularly beneficial there, although all exercise seems to support global cognition. And then the final piece is, you said free sport, sports that include some kind of complex motor component. Some of the research calls it open skill sports compared to closed skill sports. So a closed skill sport is like running, cycling, unimodal, whereas an open skill sport would be like a racket sport, those kinds of things that require much more complex motor skills, but also you're constantly reacting to the environment, right? You don't know where your opponent's going to hit that ball. You have to respond in time, right? Positionally, you have to anticipate, all that kind of stuff. And then, dancing kind of fits into that as well, as do some other, there are other coordinative sort of sports that go in there, like martial arts, Tai Chi, those kinds of fit in there. And there are, the evidence we have so far suggests that those kinds of sports have an outsized benefit for the brain in particular, probably because for a given level of physical demand or stimulus, you get this additional cognitive stimulus. So I think a balance of all of those things is important, and you can get a lot of your aerobic training from a free sport or an open skill sport. So that's kind of like you can get your best bang for your buck that way.
Yeah. Another great breakdown. I know we're running out of time. I wish I had more time with you because I have so many more questions. I just, maybe we could finish with, I'm super curious to know what you're really excited about in this field of cognitive performance, in cognitive decline. Like, is there a field of work that you just think is going to have such a huge difference in a decade, 2 decades? It can be as sci-fi, ridiculous, radical as you want, but is there anything that you're super excited about?
Yeah. So one is that I think I'm really excited just about this idea that we have a huge amount of control over our cognitive destiny, right? 10 years ago, if you'd have asked me or my neuroscience or neurology colleagues, we would have said, oh yeah, there's nothing you can do about it, right? Your brain function is your brain function. It's going to decline with age, and like you get dementia or not, and like it's just kind of the luck of the draw, right? We know that's not true at this point. All the things we talked about, physical activity, sleep, nutrition, cognitive stimulus, social interaction, all those things can change cognitive function even late in life, right? It's never too late to start engaging in those processes, and that can slow the rate of cognitive decline. And so I'm just excited about the fact that people will know that and can go out and will start to do these things. And then sort of beyond that, I think we've actually talked about the things that I'm most excited about. I'm really excited about building new ways to stimulate the brain so that we can support cognitive function in the long term. And that includes, complex learning environments like virtual reality, right? But it also includes like getting people to go out to dance classes if that's all they want to do, right? You don't need to do this with fancy equipment. And then there's how can we stimulate specific parts of the brain with some of these external technologies that we talked about, TMS, tDCS, light, vibration, like all that kind of stuff, to help both improve training, but then to improve performance, be that, in an athlete and also in an individual if they're already experiencing cognitive decline, or to prevent cognitive decline. So I'm really excited about the future of stimulating the brain. Like, that is the thing that I'm most excited about. And there are multiple different ways that we can do that.
As is the title of your upcoming book, which I'm super excited about. But it's been an absolute pleasure, Tommy. Thank you so much for your time. 1 hour is just not enough for a man that's as interesting as you are, but I'd love to have you back on soon.
I'd love to come back. I really, really appreciate having me on.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel. Check out our 26 Neuroscience book. You can download it for free